But most important from my point of view was in the appointment of people of color to positions within the government. And a great man in that was Louis Martin. Louis was actually a newspaper man originally, and he was also a part owner of the Chicago Defender. And we were sort of like Mr. Inside, Mr. Outside. He was vice chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and I was on the White House staff, and we cajoled, agitated, fought for appointments of blacks within various parts of the government. And one of my proudest, and his as well, was Thurgood Marshall on the Supreme Court, Bob Weaver in the Cabinet, Andy Bremer in the Federal Reserve, places where black people had never been. And I remember when we got President Johnson to put Andy Bremer on the Federal Reserve, Johnson said, "I like so much the idea of a white banker coming in and you are sitting in your rocking chair and saying, 'What can I do for you?'" And
Yes.
Johnson was that way. Johnson understood prejudice and discrimination and understood what needed to be done. And I think what people need to understand is to make changes in this society, black people can't do it on their own, nor should they do it on their own, because they will have adopted the same prejudices that they don't want to have brought to them. So you do need friends who are white. You have to presume there are friends who are white. You have to presume, as you ought to, that white people have as many decent instincts as you do. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson
Yes,
was one of the leaders,
yes.
one of those particular
Yes.
leaders in that.
Yes.
So we worked on many things. I think perhaps one of my most important roles, and I think if people go back and look at this, they will see much of it. There was something called the White House Conference to Fulfill These Rights, which was his civil rights conference, and I coordinated for him. And it included leadership from the civil rights community. And I helped raise some of this money from some friends of mine. We brought in people of all economic straits, so we'd pay for their tickets to come to Washington. People from the business community, people from the labor union communities. And in doing those things, what we were able to do is discuss issues that related to the advancement of people in this society. And
people in general.
In people in general, and with a particular emphasis on minorities. And the White House Conference to Fulfill These Rights is, I think, an excellent title, because it was to fulfill the rights of people. And we had workshops, and unfortunately, because of the late Senator Patrick Moynihan, wrote a really very mediocre report on black single-headed households. And because Pat Moynihan was a singularly effective person in creating buzz about himself and getting a lot of publicity, it distracted the attention away from many of the findings of that conference. We were talking about, God, if only we had black people with both parents in the household, the world would be sublime. Now, it also happens, by the way, that Senator Moynihan was raised by only his mother. So if there were an example, if you needed one, here was one in the white community of that. But anyway, the conference itself and its findings were great. And I remember that one of the concessions to Martin Luther King was to get Coretta to sing the national anthem at the conference. And she did, and I won't comment on it. But it was a good conference. I had a council, and in that council, Phillip Randolph, who we really need to know much more about.
Yes, we do.
Who in this society, perhaps as much as Martin and many others, but he was the ultimate leader in many ways. But we made him head of the council, and the vice head was a businessman named Benjamin Heinemann, who was head of, I think, one of the Chicago corporations, the railroad. And we had the civil rights leadership on the council table, Dorothy Height, who happily is still with us.
Yes, she
and
is.
Was a dear friend of Adele's mom as well as mine. My mother-in-law, late mother-in-law, worked at the YWCA in Harlem as well. But anyway, this council had the civil rights leadership. We had Meany when he could come, but Andy B. Miller, who was second in command of the AFL-CIO. And so the council helped develop the agenda, and there were many, many people of color and many whites who worked on the development of the programs, and I believe the conference was about 2,500 or 3,000 people at a couple of hotels here in Washington, and we had, great events and great crises. I remember working through the night to solve one of them, and it ended up with reports again that I haven't looked at in a long time, but I think would be worthy of people to see.